Daniel Carter adjusted his jacket as he walked through the crowded market of Orvac 6, a neutral space station where humans and aliens traded without conflict. It was his first time off-world, and everything around him felt surreal. Floating holographic signs, towering reptilian merchants, and the scent of something spicy hanging in the air. Just as he reached a stall selling Xaverian gemstones, a sudden hush fell over the market. The ground trembled slightly as a group of armored figures marched forward. Their silver and black uniforms, marked with the crest of the Xaverian Empire, left no doubt. These were royal guards. Daniel barely had time to react before they surrounded him. One of them, a tall figure with gleaming violet eyes, stepped forward. "Daniel Carter, by decree of Queen Silvera, you are to come with us." Daniel blinked. "I think you've got the wrong guy." The guard's gaze remained unreadable. "There is no mistake. You are required to appear before the Queen." The crowd around them whispered in hushed tones, stepping back as if afraid to be caught in the middle of something far bigger than themselves. Daniel swallowed hard. He wasn't looking for trouble, but something told him refusing wouldn't end well. With a reluctant sigh, he nodded. "Fine. But can someone at least tell me why?" The guards ignored his question, motioning for him to follow. With each step, Daniel felt his heart pound faster. What could an alien queen possibly want with him? The royal summons. Daniel was escorted to a towering Xaverian starship, its sleek silver exterior gleaming under the artificial lights of the docking bay. Inside, the corridors were lined with bioluminescent vines that pulsed with soft blue light. Despite the beauty, there was an unmistakable sense of authority in every detail. The journey felt like a blur. Daniel barely had time to process what was happening before he found himself inside a massive throne room aboard the Queen's flagship. Tall pillars of dark crystal lined the chamber, and at the center, on a throne of silver and obsidian, sat Queen Silvera. She was regal and imposing, her dark silver skin reflecting the light from the high ceiling. Her violet eyes studied him, piercing yet unreadable. "You are the human named Daniel Carter," she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel hesitated before answering. "Yeah, that's me. Look, I don't mean to be rude, but what's this about?" The Queen's lips curved slightly. Not a smile, not quite a frown. "You are to live with my daughter." For a moment, Daniel was certain he had misheard her. "Excuse me." Silvera's voice remained calm, but firm. "It is my decree. You will live in the royal palace, under my daughter's care." Daniel's mind raced. He wasn't some political figure or an ambassador, just a guy who came to Orvac 6 to see the galaxy. So why was a queen suddenly assigning him to her daughter? I appreciate the invitation, but I think I'll pass," he said, forcing a nervous chuckle. The guards tensed, and the Queen's expression hardened. "This is not an invitation, human. It is a command." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. He wasn't sure how powerful the Xaverian Empire was, but judging by the whispers of fear he had heard about them, arguing wasn't the best idea. Still, he wasn't about to just accept this without an answer. "Why me? You have millions of warriors, scholars, and diplomats in your empire. I'm just a traveler." The Queen's gaze softened, just a fraction. "You are more than you realize. In time, you will understand." Before he could question her further, the Queen gestured to a figure standing behind her throne. A young Xaverian woman stepped forward, her piercing silver eyes locked onto Daniel's with unreadable intensity. Princess Calith. Her dark purple hair flowed behind her like silk, her stance rigid and proud. Unlike her mother, she did not look impressed by Daniel at all. In fact, she barely acknowledged him, her expression one of mild irritation. Daniel sighed. This was going to be a long journey. Daniel followed the silent guards down a long crystal-lined corridor inside the Xaverian palace. The air was thick with the scent of something floral, but unfamiliar. Soft lights pulsed along the walls, almost as if the palace itself was alive. He stole a glance at Princess Calith, who walked slightly ahead of him. She moved with a graceful but rigid posture, as if every step had been practiced 1,000 times. Her silver eyes remained fixed ahead, showing no sign of interest in him. Daniel had been in awkward situations before, but this was on a whole different level. Finally, they reached a large doorway that slid open without a sound. The room beyond was massive, far bigger than any apartment he had ever lived in. Dark purple drapes hung from the walls, and a soft glow came from the ceiling, casting the room in a calming light. There was a large, elegant seating area in the center, a few floating orbs rotating gently above it. Kelith stepped inside first, stopping only when she reached the far end of the room. Without turning, she spoke for the first time. "This will be your living quarters." Daniel hesitated before stepping inside. "Not bad. I was expecting a prison cell, honestly." Kelith finally turned her gaze toward him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a trace of irritation in her eyes. "Do not mistake this for hospitality, human. I did not choose this arrangement, nor do I welcome it." Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, well, neither did I." The princess studied him for a moment before scoffing lightly. "At least we agree on something." She turned to leave, but Daniel wasn't about to let her walk out without some answers. "Wait." She stopped but didn't turn. Daniel took a step forward. "Why did your mother bring me here? She keeps saying I'm more than I realize, but I have no idea what she's talking about." Kelith let out a slow breath before finally turning back. For the first time, Daniel noticed something in her gaze. Annoyance, but also something deeper. Was it frustration? "You truly don't know?" she asked, almost to herself. Daniel shrugged. "No clue." Kelith studied him for another moment before shaking her head. "Then you are even more foolish than I thought." Before he could respond, she walked out of the room, the door sliding shut behind her. Daniel let out a sigh and collapsed onto one of the strange-looking seats. It was softer than expected, adjusting to his weight like memory foam. He rubbed his temples. "What have I gotten myself into? A royal dinner." That evening, Daniel was summoned to a grand dining hall. A long table stretched across the room, filled with exotic foods. Fruits that glowed faintly, dishes that steamed with unknown spices, and meats that looked suspiciously purple. Kelith sat at one end, her posture straight and regal. The queen sat at the head of the table, watching Daniel closely as he approached. "Come, human. Sit." Daniel hesitated before taking a seat across from Kelith. The queen gestured, and a servant poured a bright blue liquid into a crystal glass in front of him. Daniel glanced at it, unsure whether it was safe to drink. The queen chuckled. "Do not fear. It will not harm you." Daniel picked up the glass and took a cautious sip. It was surprisingly sweet, with a taste almost like honey and mint combined. Kelith, however, remained silent, pushing her food around her plate without much interest. The queen observed them both for a moment before speaking. "I see you two have not yet become comfortable with each other." Kelith scoffed. Was that ever in question? Daniel sighed. "Look, I don't know why I'm here, and clearly, neither does she want me here. So can someone just tell me the point of all this?" The queen's gaze remained calm, but her words were firm. "You will remain here under my daughter's watch. There is a reason you were chosen, and soon you will understand." Daniel clenched his jaw. He was tired of cryptic answers. "And what if I don't want to stay?" Kelith smirked slightly. "You have no choice." The queen simply watched him, then stood. "Finish your meal. You will need your strength." With that, she left the hall, leaving Daniel and Kelith alone. The silence between them was heavy. After a long moment, Kelith finally spoke. "I suggest you stop asking questions. You will not like the answers." Daniel sighed and leaned back in his chair. Something big was happening, and he was caught right in the middle of it. Daniel woke up in his lavish quarters, but the comfort of the Xaverian palace did little to ease his mind. The queen's words from the night before still echoed in his head. "There is a reason you were chosen." But no one was telling him what that reason was. He had been forced into an arrangement he didn't understand, expected to live under the care of a princess who clearly despised him. His patience was running thin. With a sigh, he got up and decided that, if no one was giving him answers, he would find them himself. The Silent Palace. The palace was massive, far larger than he had realized. As he walked through the corridors, he noticed something odd. No one spoke to him. The guards remained still like statues. The servants bowed but never made eye contact, and even when he passed Xaverian nobles, they whispered to one another but said nothing to him. Daniel could feel it. Something wasn't right. He wasn't just a guest. He was being watched. He turned a corner and found himself in a long hall lined with portraits of previous Xaverian rulers. Their violet eyes, just like Calith's, seemed to follow him as he walked past. But it was the last painting at the end of the hall that made him stop. It was a depiction of Queen Selvera and a young Calith, but there was a third figure in the painting, a human man. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. A human. In Xaverian history. He stepped closer, studying the figure. The man was dressed in fine Xaverian robes, standing beside the queen with an air of importance. But before Daniel could get a better look, a voice spoke behind him. "You shouldn't be here." He turned to see Calith standing in the entrance, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You never told me humans were part of your history," Daniel said, motioning toward the painting. Calith's eyes flickered to the portrait for a brief moment before looking back at him. "Because they are not." Daniel frowned. "That's not what this says." Calith sighed and stepped closer. "That man was not part of our history. He was a mistake." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "A mistake." Calith hesitated, then finally said, "He was chosen, just like you." The forgotten past. Calith walked past Daniel, standing before the portrait. Her silver eyes seemed distant, as if remembering something painful. "The Xaverian Empire has stood for thousands of years," she said. "Our rulers are chosen with care. Our traditions are unbreakable. But long ago, my mother broke one of those traditions." Daniel listened closely as she continued. "There was a prophecy, one that spoke of an outsider, a being who would change the course of the empire forever. My mother believed in it. She brought a human into our world and gave him a place by her side." Daniel's breath caught. "Was he your father?" Calith turned sharply, her expression turning cold. "No, he was a warrior, the leader. He was supposed to prove that unity between our species was possible." Daniel could hear the bitterness in her voice. "But it didn't work, did it?" Calith's jaw tightened. "He failed. He was supposed to protect my mother's vision, to stand beside her in reshaping the empire. Instead, he disappeared, vanished before his destiny could be fulfilled." Daniel took a deep breath. "And now, your mother is trying again. With me." Calith finally met his gaze. "Yes." Silence filled the space between them. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling up. "And what if I don't want to be part of this prophecy?" Calith's voice was firm. "You don't have a choice." Unraveling the mystery, Daniel stepped away from the portrait, his mind racing. This was bigger than he had imagined. He wasn't just some human who had been brought here on a whim. He was part of something much larger. "Does your mother believe I can succeed where the last human failed?" he asked. Calith hesitated, then said, "She hopes so." Daniel let out a slow breath. "And you? What do you think?" Calith's expression hardened. "I think humans are unpredictable. You might be stronger than you look, but you don't belong here. And if you make one mistake, my people will never accept you." Daniel clenched his fists. He was tired of being underestimated, tired of being treated like a pawn. "Then I guess I'll have to prove you wrong," he said. Calith studied him for a moment, then turned away. "We'll see." As she walked off, Daniel stood there, staring at the portrait of the human who came before him. One thing was clear. He needed to find out what really happened to that man. Because if history was repeating itself, He needed to make sure it didn't end the same way. Daniel paced inside his quarters, his mind racing. The revelation from earlier still lingered in his thoughts. He was not the first human brought into the Xaverian royal family. But what happened to the last one? And why was Queen Selvera so certain that he was meant to fulfill this mysterious prophecy? Frustrated, he sat down on the edge of the large, soft seating platform. He needed answers, but Caliph had no intention of helping him. She barely tolerated his presence, and their conversation earlier had only reinforced how little she trusted him. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Before he could respond, the door slid open, and Caliph stepped inside. Her arms were crossed, her silver eyes sharp as ever. "Get dressed," she said bluntly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I am dressed." Caliph sighed. "You're coming with me. Now." Daniel hesitated. "Where?" She turned and walked toward the door, not bothering to explain. "You want answers? Then follow me." A lesson in survival. Daniel followed Caliph through the palace halls, past towering pillars of violet stone and large windows showing the sprawling alien city outside. For the first time, he noticed hundreds of Xaverians moving about in the streets, merchants, travelers, and armored soldiers standing guard. They reached a transport dock, where a sleek black hovercraft awaited them. Caliph stepped inside, motioning for Daniel to follow. As soon as he sat down, the vehicle lifted off, soaring above the city. "Are you finally going to tell me where we're going?" Daniel asked. Caliph leaned back, arms crossed. "A test." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "I didn't agree to any test." Caliph smirked slightly. "You agreed the moment you stepped into this ship." Before he could argue, the hovercraft descended, landing in what looked like an ancient training arena. Massive stone walls surrounded them, with deep cracks running through the structure, proof of centuries of battles. Daniel stepped out and looked around. Several Xaverian warriors stood nearby, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Caliph turned to face him. "If you want to survive here, you need to prove yourself." Daniel frowned. "Prove myself how?" Caliph motioned to one of the warriors, who stepped forward, holding a long Xaverian energy staff. The weapon crackled with blue energy as the warrior twirled it effortlessly. Caliph smirked. "Try not to die." Daniel barely had time to react before the warrior lunged. The first fight. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He dodged the first strike, feeling the crackling energy of the weapon just inches from his chest. "Whoa! No warm-up," he shouted, stepping back. The warrior didn't respond, swinging the staff again. This time, Daniel barely managed to block with his forearm, the impact sending a jolt of pain through his body. He had fought before, back on Earth. He had trained in basic self-defense, but this was different. The Xaverian warrior was faster, stronger, and had a weapon Daniel had never seen before. Caliph watched from the side, her expression unreadable. Daniel gritted his teeth. He wasn't about to lose. The warrior swung again, aiming for his legs. Daniel jumped, barely avoiding the strike. Before the Xaverian could recover, Daniel used his momentum to land a punch straight to the warrior's side. The crowd gasped. The warrior staggered back, looking shocked. A human had landed a hit. Caliph raised an eyebrow, mildly impressed. But the fight wasn't over. The warrior growled and rushed forward again. This time, Daniel was ready. He sidestepped, grabbed the warrior's wrist, and twisted, using the warrior's own momentum against him. The Xaverian crashed to the ground, his energy staff rolling away. Silence fell over the arena. Caliph stepped forward. "Not bad." Daniel breathed heavily, rubbing his sore arm. "I'll take that as a compliment." Caliph smirked. "You lasted longer than I expected." Daniel rolled his eyes. "Glad to hear I'm exceeding expectations." An uneasy alliance. After the match, Caliph led Daniel back to the hovercraft. As they lifted off, she finally spoke. "My mother believes you're special, that you will change everything." Daniel sighed. Yeah, I've heard that a few times now. Calith's silver eyes studied him. I don't believe in prophecies, but I do believe in strength. Today, you showed me you're not completely useless. Daniel smirked. I'll take that as another compliment. Calith turned away, looking out the window. You're still an outsider. But maybe, just maybe, you might be worth keeping around. Daniel leaned back in his seat, exhaustion setting in. He had survived the first test, but he knew there were many more to come. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, his muscles sore from the fight in the training arena. The adrenaline had worn off, and now the pain had fully set in. Every time he moved, a sharp ache reminded him that Severian warriors were no joke. He looked down at his hands, still covered in dust and sweat. He had won, but the victory felt empty. What had he really proved? That he could take a few hits and fight back. It didn't answer the bigger question. Why was he here? A soft chime echoed in the room, signaling someone at the door. Daniel sighed. Come in. The door slid open, and to his surprise, Queen Selvera stepped inside. She was as regal as ever, dressed in long flowing robes of deep violet, her silver skin glowing softly in the dim light. Daniel immediately sat up straighter. He hadn't expected a personal visit from the queen herself. Selvera studied him with her piercing eyes before speaking. You did well today. Daniel exhaled a short laugh. Tell that to my ribs. A small smile touched her lips, but it vanished just as quickly. She stepped forward, folding her hands in front of her. You are wondering why you are here. Daniel leaned forward. You read minds too. The queen ignored his sarcasm. I believe it is time you'd know the truth. A royal gamble. Selvera walked to the large window overlooking the glowing city outside. Her voice was calm but firm. The Severian Empire is at the edge of war. Daniel frowned. With who? She turned to him. The Virex Dominion. The name meant nothing to him, but the way she said it made his stomach tighten. Selvera continued. They are a species who believe in conquest. They do not negotiate. They do not seek peace. They only consume and destroy. Daniel rubbed his temples. Okay, but what does this have to do with me? The queen's gaze hardened, because history is repeating itself. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. The human from the portrait, he whispered. Selvera nodded. He was meant to unite our people and prepare us for the war to come. But he disappeared before he could fulfill this purpose. Daniel swallowed. And you think I'm here to finish what he started? The queen stepped closer. You do not understand what makes humanity special. Daniel raised an eyebrow. I'm just a guy who got dragged into a royal mess. Selvera smiled slightly. You are more than that. Humans are unpredictable, adaptable. You possess a resilience that no other species has. She gestured to the city. My daughter believes strength is only in the body, that warriors must fight with their fists and weapons. But true strength is something more. Daniel sighed. And you think I have it? The queen's eyes pierced through him. I know you do. A difficult choice. Silence filled the room as Daniel processed everything. So what happens now? He asked. Selvera turned to leave. That depends on you. Daniel frowned. What's that supposed to mean? The queen stopped at the doorway. Calith must see it too. Daniel blinked. See what? Selvera glanced over her shoulder. That you are worth fighting for. And then she was gone. Daniel sat there, staring at the door. His chest felt heavy. This wasn't just about some prophecy. It wasn't about fighting or proving himself in an arena. This was about Calith, and whether she could trust a human to stand beside her when the war began. A new understanding. The next morning, Daniel found Calith in the training courtyard, practicing with her energy staff. He stood at the edge, watching as she moved with effortless precision, each strike powerful and controlled. After a moment, she stopped and turned. You're staring. Daniel smirked. It's impressive. Caliph twirled the staff before resting it at her side. "Did you come to fight again?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I came to talk." Caliph raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Daniel took a deep breath. "I know why I'm here now." Her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "The Queen believes I have something that your people need, that I can help prevent the war that's coming." Caliph scoffed. "You? A single human?" Daniel shrugged. "It sounds crazy to me too, but you don't trust me, and I get that." She tilted her head slightly, watching him carefully. Daniel took a step forward. "So let's change that." Caliph narrowed her eyes. "And how do you plan to do that?" Daniel smiled. "By proving that I'm not like the last human who failed you." For a long moment, Caliph said nothing. Then, to Daniel's surprise, she nodded. "Very well, human. Let's see if you're worth keeping around." Daniel exhaled. This was a start. And for the first time since arriving in the Xaverian Empire, he felt like he actually had a chance. Daniel stood in the courtyard, gripping the hilt of the Xaverian training sword Caliph had given him. The weapon was lighter than he expected, but it pulsed with an energy he didn't understand. Across from him, Caliph watched with her usual cold intensity. "Show me what you've learned." Daniel took a deep breath. He had been training under Caliph for days now, but no matter how hard he pushed himself, he still wasn't on her level. Xaverians were faster, stronger, and more disciplined. But humans had something they didn't: adaptability. Caliph lunged first, her energy staff crackling as she swung. Daniel barely managed to block, the force vibrating through his arms. He stepped back, adjusting his stance, then countered with a quick strike to her side. Caliph dodged, smirking. Better, but not good enough. She moved faster than he could react, sweeping his legs out from under him. Daniel hit the ground with a hard thud. He groaned, staring at the sky. "I really hate this part." Caliph held out a hand. "You're learning." Daniel hesitated, then took her hand. The moment their fingers touched, he felt a strange jolt of energy pass between them. Caliph's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly pulled away. Daniel frowned. "What was that?" Caliph shook her head. "Nothing." But there was something different in her expression, something uncertain. Before Daniel could ask more, a loud alarm echoed through the palace. The training ground flashed red as guards ran past. Caliph turned sharply. "We're under attack. The rebellion strikes." Daniel followed Caliph through the halls as the palace shook from distant explosions. Xaverian soldiers were already engaged in battle, their weapons clashing against intruders in dark armor. "Who are they?" Daniel shouted over the noise. Caliph's jaw tightened. "Rebels." Daniel's stomach sank. He knew the Xaverian Empire wasn't perfect, but he never imagined internal enemies. They turned a corner just as a blast of energy struck the wall beside them. Daniel ducked as Caliph spun into action, taking down the nearest attacker with effortless precision. More rebels rushed forward, their eyes burning with hatred. Daniel gritted his teeth. He had no armor, no advanced training, but he wasn't going to stand aside. Gripping his sword, he charged into the fight. Proving his worth, the first rebel swung at Daniel, but he ducked, dodging the attack just in time. Using Caliph's training, he sidestepped and countered with a quick slash, knocking the enemy's weapon aside. Another charged from behind, but Daniel reacted on instinct, twisting, using the enemy's momentum against them, and sending them crashing into the wall. Caliph noticed. For the first time, she looked truly impressed. But the fight wasn't over. A massive explosion rocked the palace, and Daniel turned to see a group of rebels charging toward the throne room. Caliph's eyes widened. "My mother." Without thinking, Daniel grabbed her wrist. "Let's go." Together, they ran toward the throne room. The Queen's fate. When they arrived, the battle was already raging. Queen Selvera stood at the center, her golden energy shield flickering, as she held off multiple attackers. But she was outnumbered. Caliph roared in fury, leaping into the fight. Daniel followed, his body moving on pure instinct. One rebel aimed for the queen, their blade raised for a final strike. Daniel threw himself in the way, blocking the attack just in time. The force knocked him to his knees, but he didn't let go of his sword. The queen's eyes met his. For the first time, she looked shocked. Daniel gritted his teeth. "Go. We'll cover you." Zelvera hesitated, then nodded. She activated a hidden escape mechanism, disappearing into a corridor. Caliph fought harder, her movements fierce and precise, but the rebels weren't stopping. More and more poured in. Daniel knew they couldn't win like this. "Caliph," he shouted, "we need to get out of here." Caliph clenched her fists, clearly hating the idea of retreating. But after a moment she nodded. Together, they escaped through the secret passage, leaving the throne room behind. A new path forward. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of an underground chamber. The queen was already there, along with her royal guards. Zelvera turned to Daniel, her eyes filled with something new, not just gratitude, but respect. "You saved me." Daniel exhaled, still catching his breath. "I wasn't going to let you die." Caliph looked at him, and for the first time, there was no trace of doubt in her eyes. She stepped forward. "You are not like the last human. You stayed. You fought." Daniel smirked. "I told you I would prove it." The queen stepped forward. "Daniel Carter, you have earned your place among us." Caliph met his gaze. "Now, we fight together." Daniel nodded. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about choosing to stand for something greater. And for the first time since arriving in the Zavarian Empire, he felt like he truly belonged.